Hey, fourth grade. I'm back again for a read aloud today from Escape from Slavery by Doreen Rappaport. Today I am going to read A Shipment of Dry Goods. And this is the other story I wanted to share with you about Henry Brown, and it's a lot more detailed. And it starts with him as an adult versus him as a little boy. So see if you can notice some of the differences and some of the similarities between the stories. I was going to include a compare and contrast sheet, but just think about the stories as you hear them, or this story as you hear it, and just kind of go from memory of our picture book, Henry's Freedom Box, and see if what you notice. So here we go. A shipment of dry goods. Henry Brown sat on a wooden stool that was too narrow for his large body, slowly separating tobacco leaves from their stems. Most mornings, the past 15 years, he'd sat on this stool in the factory of Richmond, Virginia, separating the leaves, moistening them with fluid, and then pressing them into lumps. 14 hours a day in the summer, 16 in the winter. Henry's master had Henry work in a factory because he needed the money Henry made more than he needed him on the plantation. Henry paid his master $275 a year from his wages, and it was allowed to keep the rest. 120 out of the 150 workers in the factory were slaves hired out by their masters. Slaves were a good investment. You could always earn back what you paid for them and then some by hiring them out. Henry's wife, Nancy, was owned by another master. Her master hired her out as a house servant, but Nancy's earnings didn't satisfy him, so he demanded that Henry pay him $50 a year if he wanted Nancy to live with him. Of course, Henry had to feed and clothe his family too. The four of them lived in a sparsely furnished one-room cabin. With the garden plot that Nancy had painstakingly carved out in front of their cabin, they had enough food. Most importantly, they had each other. In their 12 years of marriage, Henry had even managed to save some money, hoping someday to buy his family's freedom. But now he knew that plan had been a fool's dream. He would spend the rest of his days on this stool fighting off boredom and pain. And the rest of his nights he would be alone in the cabin, aching with sadness. Yesterday morning, when he'd left Nancy and the boys to go to work, Nancy had hinted that she'd have a surprise waiting for him when he returned. It was August. The garden overflowed with okra and tomatoes. Henry loved the soft red fruit and crisp green vegetables smothered in onion sauce. The sauce was Nancy's mama's recipe. When he asked her how she made it, she always teased him that only the woman in her family were given the secret. 14 hours later, when Henry returned home, there was no sauce, no Nancy, no Joshua, no Ezekiel. They were gone, hauled away to the auction block and sold to a man in North Carolina. Sold away like his mama and sisters and brothers had been sold, never to be seen again. Henry had run and begged his owner to buy them back. Henry had showed him the $120 he had saved over the years and pleaded with him to give him another $800 or so to buy back Nancy and the children. His owner had laughed and dismissed him with a, "Idiot, go to work and don't bother me no more." Henry fled to the church to absorb Job's patience, Solomon's wisdom, and Jesus' love and forgiveness. But nowhere in the Bible did he find a satisfactory answer for such injustice. He returned home to wait for the morning to wait to take his place in the hot factory on a stool suited for a child, not a man. Henry stopped at the corner and peeked around it before he turned into the street. There was no one in sight on the city streets. At 4 a.m, he didn't expect there would be, and he knew he was safe if anyone were to question him. He had a pass from the factory overseer in his pocket. Whenever slaves ventured out alone, they needed passes signed and dated by their masters. This pass was proof that they had permission to be out, proof that they weren't trying to escape. But even with the pass, Henry didn't want to meet up with any white folks today. He hurried down the empty street until he came to a sizable store whose windows were filled with farm implements and supplies. A sign above the door read, "See Bullet," although the black man couldn't read it. It was too early for anyone to be out buying anything, but Henry looked through the store windows just in case. He turned the knob on the front door. It was locked, just as Mr. Bullet had said it would be. He continued down the street, turned another corner, and made his way to the back of the store. That door was open as planned. He walked on tiptoe through the storeroom of unpacked supplies to a small room off the front of the store. A man was leaning over his desk, his back to Henry, busily writing among a clutter of papers. Henry took a deep breath. "Mr. Bullet, sir?" The storekeeper turned around and acknowledged the greeting with a nod. He was a slender, middle-aged man, long, narrow face, stern gray eyes. He put a finger to his lips, walked around his desk toward the front of the store, checked the lock on the front door, and came back. "Can't be too cautious, Henry." His southern drawl was as thick as Henry's master's. "No, sir," Henry answered quickly, as he always answered white men. Henry heard the back door open. "Who's there?" the shopkeeper shouted gruffly. "James Smith. We did have an appointment here today, didn't we?" A tall man, the color of ginger, dressed in a fine suit that marked him as a gentleman, nodded to the storekeeper and eagerly grabbed Henry's hand. "Nice morning for a trip, brother." Henry saw the storekeeper's eyes take in his friend's amber skin, thin nose, and small mouth. James Smith was an educated, free-colored. He could read and write better than most men, but Henry knew that Bullet saw him as just another black man. Henry's heart swelled with affection for his friend. In the last 8 months, there had been too many nights to remember when Henry had cried with Smith. Never thought he'd cry in front of another man. It was Smith who had told him to consider escaping. He had told Henry that he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a network of people who helped slaves escape north. If Henry wanted to escape, he would help him in any way he could. And Henry had come up with his own plan. James Smith's eyes rested on Henry's right hand, where the skin on 2 fingers was eaten away. "Spill too much of that vitriol oil you give me on it," said Henry. "But it worked good. My fingers worry Allen so much, when he see 'em, he told me to go right home and put a poultice on 'em. In the 5 years he'd been a factory overseer, that man never gave anybody a day off." Henry smiled and pulled a paper out from his pocket. "Gave me a pass for 3 days, too. So he won't be looking for me now." "Do you want to see the crate?" the storekeeper asked impatiently. Henry picked up the white man's impatience and nodded nervously. He had no illusions that Bullet was helping him because he liked him or because he believed slavery was wrong. Bullet was helping him because Henry was paying him good money. The two black men followed the storekeeper into another small storeroom. In the center of many unpacked boxes of goods was a wooden crate. As you ordered, 2.5 feet wide, 3 feet long, 2 feet 8 inches deep. Smith stared at the crate, then at Henry's muscular arms and large frame. Henry weighed 200 pounds and was 5 feet 8 inches tall. How are you expecting to fit in there, Henry? Henry ran his hands over the rough pine planks. He lifted the lid of the box and slid his fingers over the baize lining. I can take it for 2 days or so. He smiled at his friend. And it sure beat walking 250 miles. Maybe so, maybe not, responded Smith. But what will you do if they don't keep the crate upright? I know how careless these transport men can be. Nothing to worry about, the storekeeper protested. I'll be sitting alongside Henry all the way to Philadelphia. Well, what's the route? Asked Smith. We go by wagon to the Potomac, cross by steamer to Washington, then by rail to Philadelphia. Henry heard the resentment in the white man's voice. White men didn't like explaining themselves to black men, even if the black men were free. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out a tool, no bigger than his hand, with a screw point at one end and a cross handle at the other. He stepped into the box, bent his knees, and sat down. It felt cramped already. He wrapped his arms around his knees and pulled them closer to his chest to get more room. Okay, close it, he said, bending his head down. Bullet slammed the crate lid down. Henry pressed the tool into the top of the crate right over his head to mark holes for breathing. He turned the tool 2 times. Then he shouted, Open up! Smith's worried face greeted Henry when the lid was lifted. Henry pressed the pointed screw into the lid again, slowly turning it around and around until it made a tiny circle, too tiny for anyone to see, and possibly too tiny to breathe through. He turned the screw 3 more times. The opening was a mite bigger, but he didn't dare make it any bigger or it might be seen. He made 2 other holes on either side of the first. You done? The storekeeper asked sharply. Almost, sir. Henry pulled a shriveled object out of his pocket. Mr. Bullet, sir? If you kind enough to show me your bucket, I'd like to fill this here rabbit sack with water. That and a few small biscuits should hold me till I get up north. Henry filled the sack with water and tied it with a thin piece of leather. I'm going in my office now, Bullet said brusquely. Adams will be out by about 7. You 2 stay here. It was an order. 2 hours later, Henry Brown embraced his friend and stepped into the box. Bullet closed the lid up the box and tied it with the hickory hoops on each end. With a large grease pencil, Smith wrote on the crate, to W.H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This side up with care. Without a word to Smith, Bullet went back to his office and waited for the men from Adams Express. James Smith took a last look at the crate and left the store by the back door. I got an order for a pickup from Bullet. In there, the storekeeper pointed to the storeroom without looking up. Well, take that side. I'll take it here, Frank. Ready? Lift. Mr. Bullet didn't look up as the 2 men hoisted the crate through his office, out the back door, and onto their wagon. A few minutes later, one man returned with a written receipt. The storekeeper took it without reading it. Henry felt the crate being slid into the wagon. The driver slapped the reins and the horse trotted along the streets. Not as bouncy as I expected it would be, thought Henry. After a while, the clopping stopped. A pickup. Henry assumed his crate would be pushed around some to make room for others. The men left the wagon and returned in a few minutes. Thought they said there was only 2 small boxes to pick up. Well, that's what Horace told me. How are we going to fit these 3 in? Well, complaining won't help. The wagon shook a bit as the 2 men jumped up onto it. Stand this one up and make more room. They hoisted Henry's crate up and left it standing on its side. His head and back were jerked farther down. His hands loosened from around his knees. His bent knees stiffened. If the box topple over, my head'll split open. Mr. Bullet, tell him to put me back right. He heard mumbling and heavy breathing as the men loaded other crates onto the wagon. Is that the way that crate's supposed to be? I don't know. Don't care. The balls of Henry's feet burned. His knees felt permanently locked. His back ached. With each clip-clop of the horse, he bounced up and down, hitting his head. Then he realized that Bullet had broken his word. The white man wasn't going with him to Philadelphia. At the office, the men unloaded the wagon, turned the crate on its right side, and then disappeared. Stillness surrounded Henry. For the next 2 hours, Henry tried to keep his mind off his frozen muscles and joints by silently reciting biblical psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Loud voices interrupted his silent recitation. The crate was hoisted up again and put on to another wagon. The horse picked up its trot. Henry pressed his fingers against his knees and clicked off the horse's rhythm to time each bounce and prepare for its jolt. Suddenly his mouth felt dry. He slid one hand carefully into his pocket and pulled out the water sack, but did no more than wet his lips. The wagon continued its bumpy journey. Henry gave up focusing on the horse's rhythm and returned to his silent recitations. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. A few hours later, the wagon stopped again. Henry assumed they were at Potomac Creek, where the crate would be loaded onto a steamer for Washington, D.C. He was hoisted up, carried a ways, and set down. This time, upside down. He managed to wedge his hands under his head so he could rest more comfortably. Then he realized that the air holes were under him now. Would he get any air in? His eyes began swelling as if they would burst from their sockets. The veins in his temples throbbed. He tried to lift his head up a little but couldn't move it. He felt flushed and then cold. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Henry fainted. When he awakened, he was soaked in sweat and had no sense of how much time had passed. After a while, he heard a man say, I'm tired of standing. Been over 2 hours now. I'm going to get me something to sit on. The man turned Henry's crate right side up and sat down on it. Gradually, the pressure in Henry's eyes and temples subsided. His heartbeat returned to a normal rhythm. He rubbed his hands over his knees and thighs to soothe the stiffness. He wiggled his toes until he could feel them. Praise the Lord with harp. Sing unto him with the psaltery and an instrument of 10 strings. Sing unto him a new song. Play skillfully with a loud noise. He celebrated his good fortune with a few sips of water and a few nibbles of a biscuit. At Washington, D.C., the crate was loaded onto a wagon and taken to the rail depot. Ain't enough room in this car. Let's send this one out through tomorrow. Oh, please, Lord, don't let them be talking about me. Came by express. It's got to go on. Henry heard the door of the luggage car close. The men's voices fade away. It was dark but quiet. He felt protected by the stillness around him. He sipped more water and prayed the trip would soon be over. James Miller McKim kept out of the ring of light cast by the kerosene lamp hanging on a wooden post and watched the workers unload the freight from the railroad cars. One crate after another. None seemed big enough to hold a man. McKim was a member of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. Militant black and white abolitionists in Philadelphia had created the society to help runaway slaves. The abolitionists offered the fugitives whatever they needed: food, shelter, clothing, medicine, money, and legal advice. They helped them get to the next stop on the Underground Railroad to New York or Boston or Canada. McKim had received many a telegram that dry goods, the code for men, or hardware, the code for women, were on the way. Tall black men dressed up as women had appeared at his door. Friends had brought runaways in wagons built with false drawers. But never before had he been informed that a man was being shipped in a box by Railway Express. He thought it a foolish plan to send a man this way without air to breathe. Now that he would have discouraged the man from doing it. Despite his white skin, James Miller McKim believed that slavery was another form of death. He saw 3 men place a box about 8 feet long on the platform. He walked toward the ring of light. The workers were still emptying the boxcar. Anything from Richmond, Virginia? McKim craned his neck, trying to read the address on the long wooden crate. He was looking for a box that was addressed to W.H. Johnson. The box was addressed to someone other than McKim to avert suspicion. Anything from Richmond? A man called out to another man, standing about 10 feet away. The man scanned his work orders and shook his head. No. McKim returned to the side and watched for another hour as the rest of the freight was unloaded. There wasn't any box the right size. McKim went home. That afternoon, he received another telegram from Richmond saying that his shipment of dry goods would arrive the next day. Worried that a second appearance at the station might bring too much attention, he hired a driver he knew to bring the crate directly to his house. Henry didn't know what time it was or how long he'd been wherever he was. All he knew was how close and foul the air was. Like a sultry August night in Richmond when there wasn't a whisper of a breeze. He'd taken a chance and used the tool to enlarge all 3 holes, but it hadn't helped much. There didn't seem to be much air out there to breathe. He flexed his fingers and toes and felt nothing. He rubbed the tops of his knees. No feeling there either. His bent back was so stiff, he didn't think he would ever be able to straighten it up. He'd finished his biscuits, and his water sack was almost empty, but his throat and lips were so parched, he had to have some water. He untied the sack and dipped his fingers into it. He dabbed a few drops of water on his forehead and put the sack up to his lips and savored the last few drops. Suddenly, the door of the luggage car opened and a strange male voice said, "It's in here, Dan." Henry's crate was lifted up and carried for some distance, then gently put down as if the bearer was concerned about the contents. He was outside in the fresh air. He heard the man command his horse to get going, and the horse trotted off at a leisurely pace. Dared he hope this was the last lap of his journey? After a short while, the wagon stopped. He was lifted up again, taken up some stairs, and placed on a floor. "Thanks, Dan," said a male voice. Henry heard other male voices talking. Where was he? A few minutes passed. Someone rapped quietly on the lid of the crate. "It's all right now." Henry answered faintly. "All right in here, too." "Thank God he's alive," the man shouted. "Open it up," urged another insistent voice. The hickory hoops were cut. Henry welcomed the noise as the nails were pried out. When the lid was lifted, Henry saw a blur of faces. He closed his eyes quickly, then opened them slowly to get accustomed to the daylight. His eyes met the pleased eyes of a man with skin as dark as his. Henry felt giddy with happiness. He scanned the faces of the other men in the room. They were white. Momentarily, he felt scared. Then he remembered. James Smith had told him that there were some white men up north who protested against slavery. His journey to freedom was over. "How do you do, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice stronger. "We do just fine," answered the black man. "What about you?" He grabbed Henry's hands to help him up out of the box. "Just—" Henry fainted. Two other men ran over to help lift him out of the box and carry him to a couch. Henry smelled something funny under his nose and slowly opened his eyes and smiled. "Guess I'm not feeling good, as I thought." Everyone waited for him to speak again. Henry rested for a while, then sat up and shook hands with each man as he introduced himself. When the introductions were over, he smiled and said, "I told myself if I'm lucky enough to live, I thank the Lord, and so I will." And in a rich baritone voice, he recited the 40th Psalm from the Bible. Henry Box Brown, as the liberated slave was affectionately nicknamed, recuperated from his arduous journey and then went on to Boston. He spoke of his daring escape at anti-slavery meetings throughout the Northeast. With the help of a friend, he wrote a book about his life and escape. It sold 8,000 copies in 2 months. In 1851, upon the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, which stated that runaway slaves found in free states had to be returned to their owners, Brown left for Canada. Encouraged by Brown's success, James Smith shipped 2 other slaves north, but they were caught. Smith was arrested and imprisoned for 7 years for aiding the runaways. At his release, he was honored at a mass meeting in one of Philadelphia's black churches. And that is the end of A Shipment of Dry Goods. So there was a big difference in this story, a lot more detail about Henry's really harrowing journey. Lots of detail about how he felt inside the box. Think about if you were on your head doing a headstand for just a little while and all that blood runs to your head. Well, think of poor Henry on his head for I don't know how many hours, and he actually passed out. So then I guess when he gets to the abolitionists too, Henry just doesn't pop out of the box and say hello. He actually faints again from all that he was had to deal with on that trip. And then we find out that Henry actually had to move on to Canada. He couldn't stay in Philadelphia because of that Fugitive Slave Act. His owners would come and find him. So he ended up in Canada a free man. So I will see you soon for another read aloud. Hope you enjoyed this story. Bye.